أهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة من مستقبل الطاقة، وهذه عناويننا. بعد أن غيرت إدارة ترمب الاسم والمضمون، هل أحرقت الوقود المستدام للطيران؟ والطيران التجاري يستهلك 7% من إنتاج النفط العالمي، فبأي وتيرة ينمو الطلب في العقد المقبل؟ إدارة ترمب لا تغير المعايير فقط، بل تغير الأسماء أيضا. في العالم كله هناك تسمية معتمدة للوقود المستدام للطيران أو SAF، وذلك اختصارا لعبارة Sustainable Aviation Fuel. لكن إدارة ترمب قررت وبشكل منفرد في شهر مارس الماضي اعتماد تسمية مختلفة، صارت SAF اختصارا لكلمة أخرى للوقود الاصطناعي للطيران أو Synthetic Aviation Fuel. بالطبع هذا ليس تغييرا شكليا فقط، بل يشكل تعبيرا عن تغير عميق في موقف واشنطن من الجهود الدولية لتقليص الانبعاثات في قطاع الطيران، وهذا يهدد بقلب الطاولة على التقدم الذي تم إحرازه سابقا على هذا الصعيد. نتحدث عن قطاع وقود الطائرات الذي يشكل شريان النقل الجوي العالمي، وهو يستهلك جزءا كبيرا من الطاقة العالمية، وخصوصا قطاع الطيران التجاري الذي يستهلك وحده نحو 7.5% من الطلب العالمي على النفط. في ظل نمو الحركة الجوية يتوقع الآن أن يزداد الطلب على وقود الطيران بمعدل ربما يفوق 2% سنويا على مدى العقد المقبل، وهذا يزيد الضغوط على الإمداد وعلى البنية التحتية للطاقة. ولذلك تطرح مسألة الانبعاثات الكربونية في هذا القطاع كملف أساسي في جهود مكافحة التغير المناخي. وقد كان التطور الأهم دوليا على هذا الصعيد هو إطلاق مبادرة كورسيا التي تبنتها منظمة الطيران المدني الدولي، والتي تطالب شركات الطيران بأن تقوم بشراء وحدات تعويض أو أوفست عن كل زيادة في الانبعاثات فوق مستويات مرجعية معينة. لكن الهدف الطويل المدى هو أن يتم الاستبدال الوقودي، أي استخدام وقود طيران منخفض الكربون أو وقود مستدام مثل SAF الذي يدور حوله كل هذا النقاش حاليا. SAF قبل أن تغير إدارة ترمب ما يعنيه هذا المصطلح هو وقود طيران يتم إنتاجه من موارد غير أحفورية، يعني نتحدث مثلا عن زيوت مستعملة أو نفايات عضوية أو طحالب أو مواد معاد تدويرها ينتج منها نوع من الوقود الاصطناعي. الفكرة بدأت في البحث والتجريب منذ عقد من الزمان أو ربما أكثر من ذلك، لكن الانتشار التجاري الفعلي لا يزال بطيئا. حتى الآن يشكل SAF جزءا ضئيلا فقط، يعني يقل عن 1% من إجمالي الوقود المستخدم في الطيران العالمي. لكن التحدي ليس في إنتاج الوقود وفي تكلفته فقط، بل أيضا في كيفية تنظيمه regulations ودمجه في السوق. المشاكل الأساسية هنا تشمل جوانب عدة، تشمل اختلاف المعايير الفنية، لأن ما يعتبر وقودا مستداما مثلا في أوروبا قد لا يقبل في أمريكا أو في آسيا. أيضا هناك تباين في نسب المزج الإلزامي، بعض الدول مثلا فرضت نسب مزج إلزامية معينة تبدأ تدريجيا، بينما هناك دول أخرى تفضل الحوافز بدلا من الإلزام. هناك أيضا تشتت التنظيمي، أوروبا تطبق نظاما معينا لسياسات مركبة وصارمة، أمريكا في المقابل تعتمد على الحوافز الضريبية والصناعية طبعا في عهد إدارة ترمب. في الصين وآسيا الوضع أكثر مرونة، لكنه يفتقر إلى التنسيق الدولي. بالجمعية العامة الأخيرة لمنظمة الطيران الدولي أيكاوا التي اختتمت الأسبوع الماضي في مونريال، تم اعتماد مقترحات لتعديل معايير الوقود المستخدم والوقود المنخفض الكربون أو ما يعرف ب LCAF أو الكاف، وذلك لتوسيع نطاق المصادر المقبولة دوليا ضمن مبادرة كورسيا التي تحدثنا عنها. لكن البارز هنا خلال أعمال الجمعية أن الممثل الأمريكي وجه انتقادات مباشرة لما وصفه بانحراف في عمل منظمة الطيران الدولي نحو تمويل المناخ وفرض الضرائب، وينتقد ذلك ويؤكد أن الوكالة يجب أن تركز فقط على السلامة والكفاءة في قطاع الطيران، وهو ما يضيء فعلا على التغير الكبير في الموقف الأمريكي من الوقود البيئي في عهد إدارة ترمب. إذن الوقود المستدام ومستقبله مسألة أساسية في هذا الحوار الدولي. حول هذا الموضوع استضفت ماري أوينز تومسون، النائب الأول للرئيس لشؤون الاستدامة وكبير الاقتصاديين في الاتحاد الدولي للنقل الجوي إياتا، وسألتها عن المقاربة الأفضل لتعزيز إنتاج الوقود المستدام للطيران. هل هي الإعفاءات الضريبية؟ هل هي اتفاقيات الشراء الطويلة؟ أو آليات التنسيق الدولي؟ لنتابع ما أجابت به.
All of those are important, of course, and they can be done in different combinations. But fundamentally, I think it's really a profitability issue, because you look at the artificial intelligence sector, and they don't have any problems attracting capital, and this is because people think, rightly or wrongly, that there will be huge returns in that sector. In the sector of renewable energy, the returns are usually between 0 and 5%. So that makes it logical for investors to be risk averse, because risk has to be somehow proportionate to the expected returns. So people are unwilling to take risks in this space without, support sort of for the bottom line of these investment propositions. And that's where we do need the regulators to come in and help improve the profit profile of these renewable investment projects.
And maybe it needs more subsidies for a longer period of time.
It's in the absolute, and there's also the relative. In oil, traditional oil investments, we can assume that they maybe give a return of, say, 20%. So if we say 5% in renewable energy, we understand that we have 15 percentage points that we have to overcome somehow. And this can be done, obviously by making a more even competitive environment for all forms of energy, in the first instance. And then in the second instance, of course, one could also provide tax credits and other special benefits, price certainty mechanisms, and there are many tools that can be used to make renewable energy investments more attractive, as they were used during the buildup of the wind and solar energy markets. So this is nothing new. It's been done before, and the amounts that need to be invested are similar to those that were invested in wind and solar. So really what we're missing more than anything is the will. We need the policymakers and the states to want this as much as we do.
True, but the fact is that SAF currently accounts for a very small fraction of global jet fuel use. So how realistic is the 2050 net zero pathway if production capacity remains this limited over the next decade, let's say?
Yes, indeed. So this year we're estimating some 2 million tons of SAF available in the market, and in 2050 we will need 500 million tons. And clearly, although the quantities have doubled the last couple of years, that's not enough. It needs to accelerate much further. And the thing is that there are some sort of ready-made solutions, almost close to ready-made solutions, that we sort of haven't quite sorted out yet how to get to market. And many of them are particularly interesting, maybe in the Middle East and Gulf countries. And one is this lower carbon fuel, LCAF, lower carbon aviation fuel. We, as an aviation industry, we would love to see more LCAF. It currently lacks the appropriate certifications for this to be able to be leveraged fully, although ICAO notionally approves it. So there we have an urgent certification issue. And then there's also the possibility to co-process, which means that you can insert liquids of biological origin into the mix with the fossil fuel in the refinery, and then boom, you're co-processing. And the limits put on co-processing currently are 5%. So if we could convince the refineries to co-process, we could have 5% SAF blends pretty much instantaneously with very little extra cost actually in most refineries.
I'll ask you later on about the certification, but the issue is many governments now have set SAF blending mandates that risk driving up prices before even the scale up of production. Do you think that some policy ambitions sometimes outpace industrial readiness?
Yeah, so, when you introduce mandates too early in the market creation process, when there's not enough of the product, then indeed, economics 101 would predict that the price will go up because the product is so scarce that when you force it in this way, you will tend to drive up the price. And that is indeed what we have seen in Europe with the EU mandate, and in the UK also with their mandate. We've seen the price of SAF in those markets be twice as much as the market price of SAF in those markets, which is in turn twice as much as the jet fuel price. So given the very slim margins of most airlines in our industry, it's we can understand that this is a really existential problem.
Speaking about the certifications, the ICAO Assembly emphasized the harmonizing of SAF certification under CORSIA. Why is the alignment so important for airlines? This is the first question. The second, do you see any risk if we have different sustainability definitions across various regions?
One of the founding document that founded global civil aviation is the Chicago Convention from 1944. And I think this is a fabulous document that everybody should have a look at. And those people already back then in 1944, they could see that if we're going to have a flourishing global civil aviation market, we need to harmonize and to make airplanes fly all around the world across who knows how many jurisdictions in any given day. It's obviously hugely important, that rules are harmonized so that we don't have to stop and check compliance at every border. That just doesn't work, in aviation. So harmonization is really super important across anything that concerns aviation. ICAO has been really instrumental in driving a lot of this harmonization. And of course, now this is equally important when it comes to building these new energy markets. So, if we're struggling to get investments into sustainable aviation fuels, we're just making that challenge even more difficult if we're changing the rules for the energy investors, and the rules are different between countries. And, how is anybody on the investment side going to be able to assess the size of the potential market and have confidence in their future potential returns? So harmonization is important for everybody in this international market, and that goes beyond aviation and into the energy markets.
نتوقف مع فاصل قصير نفصل بعده في مستقبل الطاقة تداعيات الانسحاب المحتمل لواشنطن من مبادرة كورسيا. التشتت العالمي بات واضحا في توجهات خفض الانبعاثات في قطاع الطيران، خصوصا في ظل الآليات المختلفة لتسعير الكربون وتعويضه، خصوصا بين أوروبا والولايات المتحدة. في الجزء الثاني من هذه المقابلة مع ماري أوينز تومسون، النائب الأول للرئيس لشؤون الاستدامة وكبير الاقتصاديين في الاتحاد الدولي للنقل الجوي إياتا، نتناول البعد الدولي لملف خفض الانبعاثات في قطاع الطيران. وسألتها في هذا المجال عن سبب الإصرار من قبل منظمة الطيران الدولي على أن تكون كورسيا هي الإجراء العالمي الوحيد المنظم لانبعاثات القطاع، وماذا لو انسحبت واشنطن من هذه المبادرة؟ لنتابع.
I don't know whose credibility it's really affecting, I feel like saying, because all of these states were obviously in the room at ICAO when they signed the agreement to create CORSIA, and then they go home and they start doing something else. I think that's a real credibility issue for them, and a much smaller one for ICAO, if I allow myself to be so picky. And it indeed speaks to the same thing, that the biggest threat to global civil aviation in all its facets is fragmentation, meaning when countries and regions start doing their own thing instead of working together and harmonizing rules and regulations to simplify the system so that we can fly across jurisdictions with greater ease. And, something I really think that we can look at to understand this point is trade policy, international trade policy, where clearly, similarly, 80 years of global harmonization to try to bring down the barriers to trade, such as tariffs and other impediments to trade, to get a harmonized, largely free trade global situation. Well, now clearly several countries have decided to just go their own way and impose their own rules. And we have seen probably we will not have any growth in global trade this year, very much because of this departure from the multilateral system. And what has been the response in international trade? Well, then it seeks other avenues, other outlets, leaves this market and goes to that market instead. Now that's devastating if we imagine the same happening in terms of global civil aviation. It could mean, sharp reduction in service for certain countries and certain routes as the global networks seeks to adapt to these fluctuating and different routes all the time. It's really not the way forward for our industry, not the way forward for the global economy. And clearly it would be missing out on a very important lever for accelerating economic growth and development. That is international.
Yeah, and that there might be another challenge with the changing U.S. policies. The Trump administration has rebranded SAF as synthetic aviation fuel instead of sustainable aviation fuel. So how does this change in U.S. policies change the whole ecosystem, the whole regulation, the whole policies of SAF worldwide?
Yes, I think it's, that there are many moving parts at the same time in the U.S. SAF policy. So some tax credits have been extended, but the size of them has been reduced. So it's a little bit hard to know exactly how that's going to impact the investors. And so there's good and bad happening at the same time. What's really good is that it hasn't been abandoned. And I think that, clearly the agricultural sector in the U.S. has a lot of influence and that the U.S. will continue to be a producer, but, probably not to the same scale as it could have been. That's for sure. And the U.S. is not the only culprit in this space, as you just mentioned. Obviously, the Europeans tend to have some pretty, self-interested policies sometimes applied to these things as well, and we will just never succeed if the response to this global challenge of creating sustainable aviation fuel for the whole industry, obviously, if we have a domestically segregated approach to that challenge.
What's different about the United States is that U.S. officials now are questioning the economic burden of global offset schemes like CORSIA. How damaging would it be if the United States, which is one of the world's largest aviation markets, what happens if it reduces or withdraw its commitment to the program?
Yeah. I mean, for sure, any market that withdraws, takes us away from the 100% coverage objective. Yeah. So for sure. Now, we're talking about international aviation and not domestic aviation. So the US is the third largest international market, if I'm not mistaken. And that's obviously, that would be a great shame. There's no doubt about it, because we would like to have a vast majority, of course, of the international market covered by this scheme. But I think it's still possible to, we're seeing more and more countries joining all the time. And I think that, you know, we will soon be at we will soon be at 80% coverage, and I still think that, you know, eventually this could.
But are we having conflicting signals from the United States? I mean, the administration has obviously there's some domestic support for SAF, as we've mentioned, and there's on the other side skepticism toward international carbon schemes, and that may be really a conflicting signal.
I think that what's going to keep the U.S. engaged is obviously their heavily the fact that they're a really big player in the international energy space, largest oil producer, and so on. And there are co-benefits, you know, with producing SAF as well, and it will help the agricultural sector in the U.S. So I think on that side we will continue to have them engaged. Whether they do it, you know, out of self-interest or out of sort of altruism in terms of promoting decarbonization in aviation, that can maybe be discussed. But I think progress will still be made, and of course, you know, the world could have made more progress on these issues if the world were more united and more attached to multilateral solutions and less attached to creating domestic champions in these fields, right? And as I said earlier, you know, that no amount of domestic champions will solve our problems. We need everybody to do this together to get to 500 million tons of SAF in 2050, that's for sure. So, you know, these things wax and wane, I think. Yeah, it's like a business cycle in sustainability. Maybe we are in a little bit of a recession in sustainability, but, you know, we're not seeing negative growth rates yet. It's still moving in the right direction, albeit a bit slower than we would have liked.
بهذا نأتي إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من مستقبل الطاقة. نلتقي الأسبوع المقبل في نفس الموعد. إلى اللقاء.